Whatever happened to Willa J. Short? Mama, we called her, although she was really our grandmother, Rosa May's mother. Whatever happened to the famous woman preacher? In the 1920s, her arrival in town was front-page news. Invitations poured in. A note in her diary says, "Received 5 more letters today." She supported the whole family, even her father, a newspaper publisher devastated by the Depression. Soon Earl Short, her husband, who'd abandoned her for another woman, wanted to cash in. He wrote one letter asking for forgiveness and another suggesting they hold joint crusades. Willa quietly divorced him. Nor was it any easier for a woman preacher in those days. A Birmingham newspaper declared her to be the first woman to ever grace a pulpit in their city. In the 1930s, traveling with Rosa May, stories spoke of crowds of 3,000. It was more than the combined 1955 Sunday morning attendance of all of Roy Weed's 100 Indiana Assembly of God churches. But by the 1940s, other young Pentecostal preachers, including Oral Roberts, Rex Humbert, Maud Amy, all of whom had sat under Willa's ministry, were establishing national reputations. In a sense, Willa was a victim of her own success. She never wrote a book, never established a mailing list, never launched a radio program, or employed the flamboyance that attended so many other ministries. She didn't have to. Her preaching carried her. But as a result, she was only as good as her last sermon. The pressures wore on her. Too many people depended on her, and if her divorce had become known, it would have ended her ministry. In the 1950s, Willa J. Short was old. And so, years after the death of Earl Short, Willa accepted a marriage proposal from Leroy Sturgis, an Assembly of God pastor in Kansas City. In 1955, she brought him to Indianapolis to see the family. They were married December 29th. Leroy Sturgis, a widower, pastored a strong church, commanded a good salary, and drove a new Imperial every year. Maybe now someone would take care of Willa for a change. But for the restless preacher woman, permanence was impermanence. She grew bored in the role of a pastor's wife, impatient with the pettiness of the women in the church, and tired of living in one city. She was still getting a few invitations, so less than 2 years later, she dragged Leroy back out onto the road with her. Willa gave Leroy the nationwide tour. They kept a home in Oklahoma City, and we would often visit and join the Mexican restaurants. I was attending a private high school in Canyonville, Oregon in 1963 when the news came that Leroy Sturgis was dying in an Oklahoma City hospital. And then Willa had a heart attack. Rosa May raced to the Indianapolis airport. She was changing planes in Chicago when Willa passed away. Leroy was in another room. He would recover and live to marry yet a third time. And so Willa J. Short, our famous grandmother, a brilliant evangelist trapped in a woman's body who had sometimes missed her own little girl's Christmas, died with only her sister at her side. There were no headlines for this story. Like an old soldier, she simply faded away. She'd even been stripped of her famous name. She died, wrote Rosa May sadly, much as she had lived, alone.